the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the NFL wire site covering the Arizona Cardinals. We've got two guys here tonight as we're recording for the third show in 4 nights. This is the equivalent of the NBA 3 games in 4 nights kind of setting. Only we are not giving load management. We're adding talent to the lineup. Seth Cox, RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site, is on, like is normally. And joining us for a part of the show, for the most of the show, is Justin Higdon, Seth's co-host for the Original Draft Breakdown podcast. So it's basically a bonus episode of the Original Draft Breakdown podcast on the Rise Up See Red podcast. Here, where I get to play, I just get to drive a little bit and let them do their thing. But Seth, welcome as always. Justin, we'll have you on. We'll thanks for coming on. In the first part of this show, though, we're not going to jump right into Senior Bowl, which is the majority of what we're talking about in this show. But we've got some more coaching updates to talk about for the Arizona Cardinals, because while we were talking about, when we recorded Sunday night, it was 3 finalists. The Cardinals are now down to 2 finalists, Mike Kafka and Lou Anarumo, because Brian Flores no longer a candidate because he took the defensive coordinator position with the Minnesota Vikings. So instead of taking that interview, which he would have had on Wednesday, he takes the job that he has available to him as a defensive coordinator, which honestly is a step up from what he was doing. He was a senior defensive assistant. With the Pittsburgh Steelers, and now he gets a full-on coordinator position with a team that could use his services and toughen up that defense there in Minnesota. But, Seth, did you find it surprising that when he had a head coaching position available on a team where if you look at outside the building, he seemed to be the favorite to get the job? What are your takes? Was that surprising for you that happened?
It was one of those things, and I think, one of my writers today kind of put it best, like, especially when it comes to the Arizona Cardinals, a bird in the hand, like take what you're going to get, right? And you've got that offer. I get wanting to see this through, but it's also getting to the point for a lot of the candidates for things like assistant coaches, offensive coordinators, defense coordinators. It's getting to the nitty gritty where they have to kind of make decisions for what's for them. And I think doing that instead and, putting themselves in a position to potentially, just have a job next year, as opposed to kind of waiting to see what the Cardinals do next week, because it's seeming at this point, and this is going to come out before the Super Bowl, it's seeming at this point that we're not going to hear anything and probably until next Tuesday at the earliest, I would guess, right?
You would think, based on, well, more than anything, and Ian Rappaport brought this up when he was talking to Bo Brack over at PHNX Network, and Michael Bidwell, who the team owner, who is involved with the interview process and the decision-making process, he is in full-on host mode. He represents Arizona in the Super Bowl, since the Super Bowl is being played here in the Cardinals' home stadium, State Farm Stadium. So not only are they going through these coaching interviews, but Bidwell is playing host to basically all the tourists, the entire NFL, and the Chiefs and the Eagles. And so while the interviews are Mike Kafka's interview happened on Tuesday. We're recording Tuesday night. I wish it would be fantastic if we could get a scoop onto how that went. Anarumo is scheduled to interview on Friday. And And while I certainly think it's possible that if in that case that interview goes well, where we could hear a report late Friday or even on Saturday that they're closing in on a deal, but likely they probably want to wait till after the Super Bowl to sort of let the Super Bowl and the Phoenix area be kind of stay in the spotlight for the league.
Have their moment and, do all of that. And that's, so that's just it. The other theoretical idea, and I think it's smart and reasonable, is that they may want to talk to Jonathan Gannon or Shane Steichen or both, right? And I doubt that there's any interest in Eric Bieniemy, probably just from the fact that he turned them down 4 years ago now. I doubt they're going to come back to that well, but you never know. But, Steichen and Gannon, they can't talk to them until after the Super Bowl. So at least say, hey, would you guys be willing to interview? And you can get that answer quickly. And if the answer is yes, set something up. They're in town. And if the answer is no, then you now you've interviewed your final two candidates and you make your decision. So
yeah,
I'm not really shocked by any of this. And I think people have to understand, like you said, more than anything, Bidwill is a guy who doesn't step out of line with the rest of the owners and ever try to put himself in the spotlight over the rest of the NFL.
Case in point, Kyler Murray contract. He did not want to set a new precedent for the fourth-year quarterback contracts. He was not willing to do that. Steve Keim was not willing to do that. And they didn't want to reset the timeline. That was a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and so, you look at that, and I just think that's where it's at right now. And I think that's, we're gonna find out, like I said, Tuesday or Wednesday next week. I expect to know who the new Arizona Cardinals head coach is. And, oh no, it happened over, it happened a week or two later. I mean, I think the other thing we have to be realistic about, and it's no surprise, is the two jobs where they allegedly are trying to keep defensive coordinator and the defensive staff on board are the two jobs that are the last to be filled.
And that was my other thought, that perhaps with how Vance Joseph, while he is out of the running as head coach, he has not, and Mike Silver has said that there is high interest in Vance Joseph around the league if he becomes available. Now, we haven't had any reports of teams requesting to interview him. It's a little bit different because it would be a lateral move, so it wouldn't be like for a promotion. But because they haven't let him out of his contract, it feels like that the team is willing to and kind of would like Joseph to remain on staff. Maybe that my other thought is that Flores probably was not okay with that. If that becomes a condition upon hiring, that they need to keep Vance for at least 1 year. The Cardinals did this once before when they hired Ken Wisenhunt. They insisted that he keep Clancy Pendergast, and he stayed on that year, but kept him on a couple more years before they simply let him go and brought in Billy Davis, who is still on the staff. But it's kind of interesting because as we talked about in the last couple of shows, I did and Seth and I did in our last show, keeping Vance Joseph as DC makes sense philosophically when you bring on Mike Kafka, for the same reason why they hired Joseph to be the DC with Cliff Kingsbury, because neither had been an NFL head coach. There's some continuity there, things of that matter. And with Anarumo, whether he's DC or remains on like a senior defensive assistant of some sort, Anarumo was on Vance's staff as a defensive backs coach when Vance coached was the DC over for Miami in 2016. Anarumo, survived several coaching staffs, several head coaches in that time over with the Dolphins. And Flores is the one guy where Vance Joseph neither had a connection, nor did it necessarily make sense schematically or personnel-wise for that to happen. And so I wonder if Flores, one, didn't like the situation well enough, and two, maybe he didn't feel like he was the favorite, and maybe he was the outsider, and perhaps because of the connection and what everyone connected is the fact his connection with Matty Ossenfort and their time in the scouting department in New England and the time together where they were both on the Patriots for forever. That seemed like the slam dunk kind of hiring. Then maybe he was getting those interviews because of that, but wasn't the favorite.
Yeah, and all of that does make sense, to kind of go through everything and figure out whether or not this is a guy that's even going to want the job with stipulations or without stipulations. And quite frankly, after what Mike Florio said on his podcast, it's kind of a relief, is it not? Because Florio said, and this was 2 weeks ago at this point, that he wouldn't be surprised if Brian Flores included the Cardinals in the lawsuit. I know they're semi already in it, but the Cardinals in the lawsuit if they hired anybody but Sean Payton. And so taking himself out of the running, it kind of takes away from that, right? Like at that point, you can be like,
well, you were in consideration and you backed out.
Right. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those situations, man. It's crazy to think about, and it's been a long process, and we kind of saw this coming from the beginning, and we knew that it wasn't going to be the hot commodity, and now it's just about figuring out who is going to end up taking this job and how it ends up playing out overall.
Yep. Coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, Best Our Cardinals Talk on the Web, we will move on to talk about the Senior Bowl. We'll bring on Justin Higdon, basically adding, we have the original draft breakdown podcast here with me tonight. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the Best of Our Cardinals Talk on the Web, and we are ready to talk about the Senior Bowl. Justin Higdon from the original Draft Breakdown podcast, co-host with Seth Cox, that they recorded I think they recorded their show Monday night, and so they kind of had a dress rehearsal. We get to talk about that here. And if you want more, by all means, this is the time of year to do it. If you already are not listening to their show, you can find their show on all the podcast platforms. But to get their bonus show and their bonus content, you go to Patreon, where you can join as at the $2 level, you get their bonus show each week, and at the $4 level, you can also get their written content that Justin has, his analysis and stuff like that. So, Justin, you've been with us for a couple of shows each of the last, I think, 2 or 3 off seasons. So welcome back. It's good to have you again. Where you guys kind of take over the show, and I get to listen to you guys' expertise, because I will say that for years and years, like, I do not consider myself at all an expert in the least on draft prospects, and especially this year where we have a new general manager and we're going to have a new head coach. I can't rely on any of my previous knowledge when it comes to what the Cardinals might actually do. So listeners, this is the insight that you're going to have. Welcome, Justin, Seth. We're going to start by talking about the Senior Bowl. They had the week of practices. You had the game this last Sunday in Mobile, and we're going to talk offensive prospects, we'll talk defensive prospects, and towards the end of the show as well, we'll have a segment where we bring up if there were anyone who disappointed, perhaps didn't help their stock as much, or perhaps just didn't they hurt their stock a little bit. So, Justin, welcome to the show. Glad to have you on. Hopefully you're not freezing your butt off out back east, because the weather's fantastic here.
No, thanks for having me. It's always fun to join you guys after the All-Star games, and then again, usually we talk around combine time. So, it's really fun. I love the fact that Arizona Cardinals fans are so into the draft. I grew up a Cleveland Browns fan, as many people know, So that's kind of why I got into it, because that was really our Christmas. We didn't have a playoff team for 30 years, and it's just one of those things where, hope springs eternal in the NFL draft. So it's always fun to talk about it. And these All-Star games are even though lately they're kind of different than they have been over the last 3 years, that they've kind of become a different entity, with guys going back to school for extra years of eligibility with the NIL stuff. But it's still intriguing to see how guys do in these settings and which guys get the hype from the big draft nicks.
And what's important to note is that with the Senior Bowl, that's a little bit different, is that these are not the underclassmen. These are the ones who are graduated or who are actually seniors or completed their degree requirements as an underclassman, and so they became draft eligible that way. So these are not your underclassmen who will fill the upper rounds of the draft. These are guys who have had an extra year of eligibility. But let's start on the offensive side of the ball. Seth, Justin, if you could pick out the guys that stood out to you the most, who are the offensive standouts and the surprises from not only the game, because the game is just a small piece of that. That's the bright lights part, but also in practice.
Seth, I'll jump in first. One of the guys that we talked about on our show, which came out on Tuesday, February 7th, was Evan Hull, the running back from Northwestern. And he was a player, Jess, that was considered an early entrant into the draft, but had graduated. He fulfilled his graduate requirements, but I think he was a solid 4-year player for them. And Seth and I talked about it. He had kind of a down year as far as efficiency numbers, but one of the things that Evan Hull always did well was he got involved in the passing game. And what he had to deal with this year at Northwestern, it was a bad team, but he was still a really productive player in terms of like cumulative stats, not necessarily efficiency numbers, but he put up a lot of yards. He scored touchdowns. And here in the Senior Bowl setting, he was one of the better practice players that people saw out there. And then in the game, he led all running backs in rushing yards, all players in rushing yards during the game. He started off the game with a 24-yard run. It was an impressive play. And he's very good pass receiver, good pass protector. And I think he took himself from being a possible undrafted free agent to being a day 3 pick. He's got decent size. He's I think he's 5'10", 5'11", like 215. He's going to run in the high 4.5s, low 4.6s, which is solid for a running back. But he just knows all the nuances of the position. And I think he's going to be a really good rotational player. He's probably going to end up with like the Chargers. They always seem to be able to pick late round running backs who can catch the ball and turn them into stars. So Evan Hull reminds me of that kind of guy. Maybe like a Patriots back too, where they kind of approach running back a similar way, where they'll have these tandems, these groups, these running back groups, and they get the best out of the guys that they have, and they pay very small dollar amount for them.
Sticking with the running backs, another guy that we've talked about a ton on our podcast, and a guy that is going to be really intriguing where he ends up in the draft process is Tulane running back Tyjae Spears. Spears had a monster year. He's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to production. This year, I mean, he had a monster year, and we talked about it. This dude put up over 600 yards rushing his last 3 games, including a massive game against USC in the Cotton Bowl that helped, lead Tulane to a win over USC. And then he came in and he just kind of continued it, right? Like he took those 3 games, including the 205 yards and 4 touchdown performance in the Cotton Bowl, and then just all of a sudden was kind of the guy that caught everybody's attention. Like they knew he was good, but they wanted to see it in person. And you just saw it. I mean, 5'10", 204, electric with the ball in his hands, a guy that can do it as a runner or out of the backfield as a pass catcher. I'm really interested to see how the NFL views him, because we've talked about it a lot. Group of 5 player. As an every down back, he's like borderline at that 204 weight, right? But like, the way that he moves, I'm gonna guess he's gonna be a low 4.5 guy. Justin, jump in if you think differently. But
I think he's going to be faster than that. I think
you,
he's going to be a 4.4 guy. And size wise, you got a good comp to Devin Singletary. Where did he go, Seth? Was he 4th round?
I think he was the 3rd.
Okay, and so Singletary also coming out of a group of 5 school, coming out of Florida Atlantic, and he had that kind of Lane Kiffin boost, but it was another player that guys became intrigued with. That was the difference was that was kind of a poor man's running back class where a lot of people thought, Darrell Henderson was the best running back in that class, myself included. He's been a good running back, but that tells you what kind of class it was, right? Henderson coming out of Memphis, having a great year the year he came out. This is a deeper running back class. So you could get a Devin Singletary sized player who's quite a bit faster at a discounted price. I like Spears a lot here.
Yeah, and so I mean, he's just a guy that I just want to see where he goes, and I think we can finish on with one more running back. I mean, we're going to talk about every position, obviously, but one more running back we should at least mention is Chase Brown. Looked really good this week as well, and you've talked about Brown on the podcast, and you've kind of been your backyard from Illinois, Justin. Why don't you go ahead?
So Chase Brown was one of the top leading ball carriers in the country, but from what I saw, it was kind of a mixed bag on him. I don't think anybody has doubts about his running ability and his vision or toughness as a runner, but I think there are some question marks about his contributions in the passing downs. And I think he didn't necessarily fare too well in the pass protection drills. So,
and he's a guy that, when you look at it, he looks bigger than he measured in at, if that makes sense.
Yeah, he's like 5'9.5" and 200, and I think he was still 215 or so. But it's interesting because his twin brother, we can circle back on this, but his twin brother plays safety and came in a little bit taller and actually really had a good week as well.
At the wide receiver position, there was one name that just like showed out all week and kind of reintroduced himself. And it's ironic because we were talking about guys like Antonio Brown, size and speed wise, before the podcast started, and how Brown went in the 5th or 6th round and became the guy that was the go-to comp for a 4'5", 5'10", 190-pound receiver, and everybody's like, oh, but Antonio Brown, this one's going to be the next one.
Right. He became the justification for moving guys like that up into the 1st and 2nd day of the draft.
But this guy, Jaden Reed, man, he was a guy that we expected a lot from this year, after his big year at Michigan State in 2021. And he's a guy that just fell victim. And Justin and I talk about this a lot. Like the LSU guys are a prime example. When things go bad in a program, it usually takes everybody down, including like their best player / prospects. And Reed kind of fell into that trap this year, right? I mean, yep. they go 11-2, finish 9th in the country, and they do lose Kenneth Walker the third, who obviously is a freak stud. Like any type of adjective you want to use towards him is fine, but they bring back almost everybody else. and they just look awful. I mean, they're
Yeah.
legitimately an awful team. And Reed was a part of that group that kind of fell into that. I mean, you go from almost 1,100 yards to now he's not even the leading receiver on a team. It was crazy. And then he just came out and goes, "Hey guys, remember me?" And
Yeah.
everybody's like, "Oh yeah, this guy was really good last year."
Well, he got banged up a little bit, and they removed him from some of his special teams duties where he excelled that year in 2021, where I think he had 2 punt return touchdowns in addition to his what was it, 12 touchdowns from scrimmage. I think he ended that year with 14 touchdowns. So he was a big play guy. He was a deep threat on that 2021 Spartans team. And that was kind of taken away this year. And part of it was Peyton Thorne not playing as well. Part of it was not having Kenneth Walker to keep the defense honest. They just weren't as afraid of Jalen Berger as they were of Kenneth Walker. So Kenneth Walker had just such a fantastic year. So it is true that he was really the only key piece that was missing from this year's team, but he was such a key piece that it really affected the whole team from top to bottom. And in college, that's one of those things where because the talent pool it's not the pros, right? There are 130 plus D1 teams, so or FBS, I guess, to use the current vernacular, but it is a real handcuff to a program like Michigan State to lose a player like Kenneth Walker, who was so valuable. And Reed, like you said, he made people remember how good he was in 2021 when he was like a 20-yard to catch guy, a deep threat, a guy who could take over a game. And this is one of the things with these current COVID rules, with the extra year of eligibility, with the transfer, the free year of transfer, and things like that, we're seeing a different landscape across the NFL draft, across these all-star games. And you and I, Seth, talked about it on our show. The NFL is having to, or they're maybe not having to, but what they are doing is start to recalibrate the way we think about these players. And I think that, right or wrong, this isn't necessarily the way I think you and I would approach this, but right or wrong, I think they are going to put a lot of stock in some of these all-star performances. And that could put a guy like Jaden Reed into the third round, where even though he didn't have a great year, they're going to look at 2021. They're going to look at this all-star game performance, and no doubt he was a big winner in those practices.
We can run through a couple other guys. Obviously, Tank Dell looked really good, but
he's tiny.
Jess will remember this name, JJ Nelson size. But he might be JJ Nelson's speed as well.
He won't be, though. I don't think.
You don't think
I think he's going to be? I think he's going to be a couple hundredths of a second. A couple tenths of a second.
So yeah, someone behind. That small and lean in the low 4.4s is different than in the upper 4.2s.
Correct. And of course, JJ Nelson ran in the 4.2s, and he's still JJ Nelson, right?
Yeah.
And you look at another guy I bring up, Jakeem Grant was like that too. Both those guys have had a role, right? But how high do you take a guy like that?
Trey Palmer played really well this week, turned a lot of heads again.
Now, he's a player who, at his size, 6 foot, 190, 195 pounds, he says he can run sub 4.3. If he does, that's a big difference than a 5'8" guy, 163 running a 4.3, right?
Yeah. Rashee Rice, he just kind of looks like he belongs, if that makes sense. I mean, when you get guys from SMU that play in that, and everybody kind of plays in the spread offense anymore, so it's not as critical, but he just looked like a guy that belonged on the field with all the top prospects, did he not?
I'll tell you this. I heard a mixed bag about Rice from the practices, but he's expected, and he came in a little bit. They listed him at 6'2", and I think he came in closer to 6 feet, but he still was around 200 pounds, which is fine. Now he's expected to run in the 4.4s and low 4.4s and have an explosive lower body strength, like vertical jump, broad jump. That's going to be something key to watch because um, it kind of reminds me, and this guy didn't test like an explosive athlete, but I remember when I seem to remember when Cooper Kupp was, and he wasn't a group of five guy, he was an FCS guy, but I seem to remember that Cooper Kupp's practice reps were kind of a mixed bag as well. He goes in the third round and becomes one of the top receivers in the NFL. Rashee Rice was somebody that draftniks were very high on all throughout the year, and then seemed to get a little bit lukewarm on throughout the week of practices. So I guess I would throw the caution flag out and say, wait, don't get too down on this guy yet. Let's see what he does at the combine. He was obviously extremely productive in this past season at SMU.
And then the last guy amongst the wide receivers was Michael Wilson, the Stanford. And again, you want to talk, the conversation we had about Jaden Reed goes for Michael Wilson as well, right? Like a guy that is was used as in a number of different ways that was on a terrible team in Stanford, and now he's kind of getting away from that. He came in at 6'1.5", 216, and he looked like a guy that can play.
And I guess he was a guy who dealt with a lot of injuries, and so this was his kind of coming out party as far as healthy. I'm out from the handcuffs of the Stanford offense, and he led all receivers in the game the other day in terms of yards.
Let me ask you this. Luke Musgrave and Davis Allen have been getting a lot of pub at the tight end position, but nobody from anything that we heard played better than Payne Durham. Are we overrating Allen and Musgrave, or is the tight end class this good?
Yes.
Perfect.
No, I think well, Allen was a weird one to me because it didn't seem like anybody was talking about him all throughout the year. He did have a good year statistically, but that was really his only year. And then Musgrave has been kind of getting hype. If you look at Big Draft, he's kind of been getting hype all year, but he was injured and didn't play much this year. This isn't a Senior Bowl guy, but it's so weird to me that to me, Michael Mayer from Notre Dame is clearly the top tight end in this class. Just size, speed, youth. He's an underclassman. And so it's been surprising to me to see him, to see big draftniks like Daniel Jeremiah put him as like the tight end 4 in this class. That's surprising, and I don't agree with it. But it is a really good class. So if you look at, I agree, Payne Durham was probably, at least as far as the game went, like there was a play early in the game. It looked like he might have scored a touchdown. He was just shy. They scored a touchdown. I think Malik Cunningham, the quarterback from Louisville, rushed it in the next play. And then they went right back to Payne Durham with the 2-point conversion. He made a play. And he's also got an NFL name. There was another Payne Durham tight end who actually came out of Notre Dame who's played in the NFL. So, yeah, you won't go wrong betting on Payne Durham. He's a guy out of Purdue, skipped a bowl game. You might scratch your head thinking, why would a guy from Purdue skip a bowl game? But he probably earned it.
The offensive line play is not our expertise. We're not going to try to lie to you about that. We'll have Solely Football on shortly for him to talk about it. But there were some guys that stood out that we'll run through real quick. John Michael Schmitz of Minnesota. Your boy DeJuan Jones of Ohio State.
He only practiced one day, but he was just so massive. He's 6'8", 6'8.5", 375. And he was just mowing guys down. He's kind of like Phil Loadholt would be a good comp, like a classic, like giant right tackle.
Steve Avila, a guy that I think would be a good fit for the Arizona Cardinals in the second round, had a good week. He's a big guard prospect, 6'3", 332. He looked good.
He's a guy, Seth, that's going to test well as well. He's older because he'll be 24 in October. But at 332, he was 300 in high school, and he had a 4.51 shuttle. Like, that's really good agility.
So he's the anti Dorian Johnson, if you remember him.
Oh,
yeah. Right.
The Cardinals drafted him, and he was going to be a plug-and-play starter.
Yeah, steal of the draft, man.
To plug the Draft Breakdown podcast, the original Draft Breakdown podcast, we would have told you that was not true.
And then Darnell Wright, who's picking up steam as a first-round pick. And I saw somebody mock that. I want to give them credit, but I cannot remember off the top of my head.
Wasn't it PFF?
Was it PFF it was before the Senior Bowl. And Wright looks like a guy that can be a dominant right tackle.
So another guy, 6'5". He came in 6'5", 342, 34-inch arms. That's all the measurables you want. He's
kind of a small guy, yeah.
Yeah, he's a tiny guy. He's only going to be 22 in August. So, and he weighed 320 in high school. So he was already a big dude. So you look at the high school testing, he ran a 5.3, which is pretty average, but 4.75 shuttle for a guy that big in high school, you probably are going to be able to project some improvement there. If you're talking about a right tackle, he fits the bill. And what I like about him too, he was a 4-year starter. You know, it's kind of, you have to do some fuzzy math because of the COVID year. But Wright started enough games that you could consider him a 4-year college starter at a big program. And I like that. I love going with the 3 and the 4-year college starters at line, especially if they could test up to NFL quality athlete levels.
All right. Coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best of our Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on and talk about the defensive standouts from the Senior Bowl. Well, actually, it'll be more like they talk about it and I listen and learn. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise of C-Red podcast, best of Cardinals talk on the web. After talking about the offensive players and the standouts and surprises, Justin and Seth continue talking about the defensive players. Who were the ones who stood out the most and surprised the most? Let's hear more about the defense now.
You want to go back to front on this one, Justin? So let's start with the guy that's been a favorite of the original Draft Breakdown podcast for the last 2 seasons, and that's Riley Moss.
Yeah, I love talking about Riley Moss because he's 6 feet, 190 plus pound cornerback from Iowa, and he's a legitimate track athlete. He was a guy who had 11. He ran 11, 10, 100-meter hurdles in high school.
Yeah, the 110-meter hurdles. Yeah,
right. He's really fast. He's gonna run in the 4.4s. He probably would have come out into the draft last year had he not injured his knee amid what was his best season. But he was able to return from that knee injury. Luckily, I think it was a PCL. So he was able to return, play this year, play well, play at a high level. Of course, the chatter early on was that they were going to move him to safety. Why? Because he's a white guy. And there hasn't been a white cornerback in the NFL, since Jason Sehorn?
Yeah,
I think they tried.
Is that really the case?
I'm pretty sure. Wow. As far as a starter, and they tried the kid that came out of Penn State. His name escapes me a couple of years ago, but he was a really super athletic, high-end tester that played safety at Penn State. He went to the Washington football team / Commanders, and I think they tried him at corner, but he wasn't a starter. Riley Moss projects as a guy who can start, and the early returns were good on him. I don't know if he actually ended up playing in the game, but he's a ball hawk. He's a fast guy. He's got good size. Not quite the arm length that you want at corner, but decent, and a player who's got quick feet, who's going to be able to stay with the receiver. So I really like Riley Moss. Had he come out last year healthy, I would have said day 2 player. Now you could probably get him on day 3, and he's going to be an exciting player for you, and he's going to be kind of making history, at least as far as this century, the 2000s.
A guy that Jess and I have watched, Caillou Blue Kelly from Stanford, had a really nice week. Another corner. He's an interesting one because he feels very Stanford corner like, right? Because he came in at 6 feet 190. He's gonna be like a mid 4.5s guy, but like he has great zone instincts on the ball, and he likes to come downhill and tackle. So if you are going to be a team that runs a zone heavy scheme, he's going to get drafted in like the 3rd or 4th round, and people are going to be like, why didn't he go earlier? Well, it's because he's going to be a guy that's, a good size, 6 foot 193, but he's going to be an average testing out athlete relative to the position. But he's just a guy that seems to get by on his understanding and instincts, and that's just something it's tough to quantify, right?
He's also Stanford cornerish in the respect that his best year came the year before he was eligible to come out into the draft. So it's one of those things where he was getting a lot of hype early first round. He was in those way too early mocks in the first round, and then it didn't really live up to it this season, but then came out in the early practices. I'm not sure if he closed the week out or if he even played in the game, but in the early practices, he was a standout. And what we talked about on our show, Seth, was that he says he modeled his game after Denzel Ward. He's bigger than Denzel Ward. He's not as fast.
I was say, he's not going to be the athlete Denzel was, though.
Denzel ran a 4.31, I believe, or 4.32. I don't think Caillou Blue Kelly is going to be that fast. But you mentioned the physicality, the ability to play downhill and make big plays, hits at the line of scrimmage. That's a good quality to have, and he does have better size coming out than Denzel had.
He really kind of does remind me of, like, it hasn't been Stanford corners as much anymore. These Washington defensive backs, guys.
That's an interesting comp, right? Because we
like
saw that
Byron Murphy
last year too,
or Trent McDuffie.
Yeah. Those guys are, they almost play like a safety, or nickel, but they're also usually athletic enough to line up outside.
Safeties were an interesting group. I think the guy that caught everybody the most, and I wouldn't say like he was a standout of the week, but the guy that made everybody kind of stand up and pay attention was Marte Mapu, the Sacramento State defensive back.
He was an NFLPA call-up?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
he's a tweener. He's a tweener.
He definitely is. I mean, we're talking about a guy that's 6'3", 217. Like, he's a big dude, but he's
what do we call that? I think our old friend Justice Mosqueda I don't know if he coined the term, but he kind of popularized it. He's an overhang defender, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's what Mapu will show. I thought other guys at the safety position that played well. I thought Sidney Brown. You mentioned him a little earlier.
Chase Brown's twin brother. Yep.
Had a nice week, and I think it was.
And he had 6 interceptions this year. He was tied for second with like a billion other players in the FBS with the 6 picks. But really, we like that when guys show those ball skills at the back, and the back of the line defense.
And then the other guy that really intrigued people was JL Skinner, the other really big safety, right, out of Boise State, 6'4", 211. And you talked about it, 4 interceptions, 5 passes defense this season from the safety position.
Why does Boise State always have like 6'3", 6'4" safeties?
That's a fair question.
That's a tradition in their program. Like George Ayuka comes to mind. I know they've had a couple other guys that names are escaping me, but it seems to be like a Boise State thing to have like a big, rangy, tall guy back there.
The linebackers were really good this week and really impressive. There's a couple that really stood out that are getting a lot of pub. And not to pat ourselves on the back, but why not start there? Ivan Pace Jr., a guy we've talked about quite a bit from Cincinnati, right? He went from the Miami of Ohio, where he was a playmaker, to Cincy, and all he did was improve at Cincy. And in a conversation we were having off the air, and I'd love to get your feedback on this. Pace came in at 5'10", 230. He had 136 tackles, 20 and a half tackles for loss, and 9 sacks this season. He had 7 sacks as a freshman at Miami of Ohio. Is this a guy that can be in the and not as a straight comparison, but be in like the Micah Parsons role now with how defenses are so multifaceted up front?
I'm going to say no because he is 5'10" with 30-inch arms, 30 and a half. So, and the other thing is Micah Parsons
was a true freak of nature. Yeah.
He ran a 4.4. He's one of the fastest guys in the NFL, and Pace, the projection on Pace is 4.8. So he's small. He's not very fast. He's got short arms, and he's not old necessarily. He just turned 22 in December, so he's not old, but he's not young either because he will turn 23 late in his rookie year. But there's no denying this guy's productivity. And what you can kind of glean from his sack numbers is, you can use him off the blitz. He's going to know how to blitz.
Is he going to be like that kid from Detroit this year?
Pure pass rusher, where he knows how to be a pass rusher. And Ivan Pace is more of an off the ball blitzer, right? He does have some pass rush to him. They used him in that role at Miami of Ohio in the MAC. They used him at that role at Cincy, but you can see he was also used off the ball too. So he's a little bit different. He's not this kind of player where he had big sack numbers, but he's small, and now you have to project him to off the ball. He's already played off the ball too. He's really versatile. And what I like about Pace is just he took a step up in competition. He didn't go all the way up, right? He went from one group of 5 to another, but he went to a very high-end group of 5 program. Cincinnati had just been in the playoffs the year before, and he comes in. He doesn't miss a beat in terms of his production. In fact, he might have even improved upon it. He's a player who's been good enough to, I believe, he was Conference Player of the Year in 2 different conferences back-to-back years. As far as defense, I could be wrong about that, but he was definitely in contention. And if you're a Wisconsin fan, and now Luke Fickell's your head coach, you are kind of getting a preview of what Luke Fickell can do with the Wisconsin type of linebackers that come through that program, which are always high end. That's got to be exciting for Wisconsin fans. I think Ivan Pace is going to be a day 3 pick, but you could take this guy in the 5th round, and I guarantee you he's going to be a special teams contributor day 1. I think he has potential to be a starter. My concern is the speed, and if he's not better than 4.8, that is going to hamper him. He'll be more of a role player special teamer.
Diane Hinley was the other guy that really stood out all week, right?
And he, I believe, is a player that is expected to test much better, if I am recalling correctly.
Well, he was also a wide receiver when he entered college,
right.
So I assume he's got athleticism if he could at least play wide receiver at a college.
Exactly. And he was ultra productive this year at Wazoo, and people raved about him throughout the week of
Yeah,
practices.
dude, he returned kicks his freshman year, averaged 23 yards per kickoff return.
Yeah, he's definitely a player that's physically he's got more upside than Ivan Pace. He doesn't have quite the production. He had production in a different way this year, but definitely a player. I know one of my good pals is a Wazoo grad, and I know he was a big fan of Henley, and he didn't disappoint. He gets into this setting and doesn't miss a beat, and that always speaks highly of the player, even if the caliber of prospect isn't as high this year as it has been in years past in the Senior Bowl.
Any other linebackers we need to mention that off the top of your head?
No,
they're an interesting group this year. Edge
it's a good
rushers.
group. Yeah,
It is a very good group. Edge rushers. I thought Will McDonald really stood out this week, but he is a small dude.
So there are a lot of people that I've talked to and communicated with about the Senior Bowl who said that Will McDonald has the best pass rush moves of any edge player that was there. But where he comes in at 6'3.5", 241 pounds, he's light. He's small. But here's where you can maybe look at some of these guys like James Houston or like Hassan Reddick. I mean, he's bigger than those guys. But McDonald had 35-inch arms. He's got extremely good arm length. And so if he can use those long arms to keep the offensive lineman out of his chest, that's huge. He's going to be 24 in June. He's old. But for a pass rusher, I don't think we're as concerned about that age, especially if you're talking about third, fourth, fifth round, right? I don't think McDonald is going to go in the first 2 rounds. But if you're looking for a really good value in the 3rd round or 4th round, this is a player, he's expected to run around a 4.6. So he's got some explosiveness to him. Even though he's older, he's got length. He doesn't have the ideal size that you want, but he has the pass rush moves. He's played at a Power 5 school. It's been a successful program while he's been there. So I really like him. He's a great bargain in this draft. I don't think you're going to have to pay that 1st or 2nd round premium.
A couple other guys that stood out. Keon White is all of a sudden flying up draft boards. Obviously,
he's already 24. I don't get that.
Obviously, the big name was Daniel Jeremiah, listing him 8th overall, but he's starting to get 2nd round mocks, which I think is more realistic. But he's kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, right?
He's 280, so he's 6'5", 280. So I think he is an edge, a big edge. So that's going to be certain schemes are going to, he's going to have to test really well to be a fit for all schemes at that size. But there are a lot of schemes in the NFL that are going to use a guy that big on the edge. And he doesn't have super long arms like Will McDonald does, but almost 34-inch, over 33.5.
Can he kick inside at all?
That's a good question.
I think he will be able to, if with the explosiveness. He seems, and Justin brought it up the other day. I think his like high end would be, I mean, obviously super high end would be like a
Cam Jordan.
Cam Jordan.
Yeah.
But
that's really high end.
Yeah, but like, what about a guy like Stephon Tuitt, who is a little bit heavier, but
and I was gonna say Cameron Hayward too, if we're talking about Steelers guys, but I think he was heavier too, and we don't necessarily know the athleticism of this guy, but a guy you and I liked, I think more than a lot of draft Twitter, was DeMarvin Leal last year. Could he be that kind of guy? This guy screams Steelers, right?
Yeah, Steelers,
but not in the 1st round. And like on day 2.
And then it's interesting because this was a group that it's older. right? Like you said, like there's a lot of older guys in
And
this
this guy's
group.
coming from Old Dominion. I think he only played 1 year at Georgia Tech.
Yeah, he started as a tight end, if I remember right.
Well, the scouts are nerds. They love that kind of versatility,
He
right?
played he did play 4 games last year, so maybe there was an injury. We'd have to probably double check that. But yeah, he
But
played
Daniel
4.
Jeremiah really set this guy's hype on fire by saying he was eighth overall. And I think you and I touched on that on our Patreon episode last week. But that's I'm not going to call. I think to call it irresponsible is too strong. But it's one of those things that you and I, as we're kind of draft nicks / draft critics, aren't we?
Yeah,
Because we'll look at something like that and be like, that doesn't add up. Like that just doesn't make sense philosophically, scouting wise. Like if you're, we, throw a couple bucks on a game here and there. If you're gambling, is that the kind of bet you're going to make? That's
right.
that's kind of bet you make after you've had some tequila shots at like 2 a.m, right?
Right. And that's when you're throwing out that kind of money.
Which we might do next weekend in Vegas.
Right.
But
Uh, Another guy that really stood out that has been on our radar since the beginning of the season is Keanu Benton, the Wisconsin defensive tackle. But he wasn't alone. Yaya Diaby out of Louisville had a good week. He's an interesting guy because he's kind of like an interior slash big, like small interior slash big edge at 6'3", 270. And that's going to be what's intriguing about him, is because that's how they used him at Louisville. He wasn't a straight up just like edge guy. And then, this is an interesting group, because another guy that we wanted to see more from, and I didn't think he exactly stood out at the Senior Bowl, but he's a guy that I feel like is going to go in the first 2 rounds, is Derek Hall out of Auburn.
well, Hall's gonna. Yeah, I think you're right, because Hall's gonna be really athletic. The thing about Keanu Benton is I think his week started hot and then he cooled off, and some of the moves he was making early on, I think the offensive line kind of caught up to him. And I don't necessarily think that's a knock on him, or it might be more that the offensive line got better, and that's a good thing too. You mentioned Diaby. That's a player that you and I covered a little bit during the regular season on our Patreon. A player who had some impressive pass rush numbers, but kind of a tweener, like you said. But again, going back to Hall, I think it's one of those things. Auburn guys, in some of these roles, like that have been highly recruited. I think, who was the guy a few years ago? Was it Cowart, who was a 5-star
Yeah.
recruit, and he just it never clicked for him. He ends up going, I think, to the Patriots and having some modest success as an NFL player. But Derek Hall came in. He's a little bit short for a defensive end, and that sounds weird because he's almost 6'3". But he's got those long arms. He's only going to be 22 in March, and we know he's going to be a really good athletic tester. So any lack of production, I think, is going to be mitigated by what I think is going to be a really good combine or pro day from Derek Hall. And he's another guy like Benton. I think he started the week hot, cooled off a little bit, and then we stopped hearing about him.
Anybody else you want to talk about before we go out to a couple of the fallers of the week?
Let me check real quick, because there were a couple. I know you and I kind of meshed all of our Senior Bowl, Shrine Game, NFLPA together. So yeah, no, I think we're clear on the Senior Bowl guys. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Like it was a good week, but again, I think this is a Senior Bowl that's just a little bit lower end talent than what we had become accustomed to before that weird 2020 COVID year kind of threw everything into a spiral.
Coming up next in the Rise Up Seared podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web, we will wrap things up talking about the guys whose stock fell a little bit, who disappointed, who hurt their stock, who didn't do as well as they'd hoped. That's coming next on Rise Up Seared. We're back on the Rise Up Seared podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. One final segment with Seth Cox and Justin Higdon as they talk about the kind of the fallers. They've talked about the defensive standouts, the offensive standouts, but who are the players that were expected to do more? Maybe their stock has fallen a little bit, didn't do as well as they thought. Who are those guys that have some work to do in the combine / pro day things that they've got coming up over the next several weeks?
Everybody that plays quarterback.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we got to start with the quarterbacks, right? It was not an impressive quarterback group from everything that you've probably heard and anything that you would have seen had if you looked at the tape from the practices, from the game. I don't know that he hurt his stock any more than it was already just kind of hanging out, but it was Max Duggan. Seth and I talked a lot about how those last few games, Duggan really made a ton of plays against Kansas State in that Big 12 championship game. He kept his team alive. He got that game to overtime, and that's probably what got them into the playoffs. But then in the playoffs against Michigan, against Georgia, he turned the ball over. He looked kind of lost at times, and then he measures in very small. I think he was listed at 6'2" and like 215, and then he came in. He was 6'1", 204. So he's like a lot of these all-star quarterbacks from the Hula Bowl, from the Shrine, from the NFLPA game, where they're all like in that 6 foot, 6'1", under 210. Like this is a small, old quarterback class. At least Duggan is still only going to be 22 in March, and he's very athletic. He's going to run a good time. He'll run in the, I think, low 4.6s. But this is a setting where you would have liked to see Max Duggan stand out, and he didn't. And I think that's unfortunate. So I don't know if this is the part where he became where his stock started to fall. I think he kind of started to fall before this, but Duggan is one that who was present that I think you have to say stock down on. Now, Seth, we talked about a guy who wasn't present. I think he was the biggest. I don't want to say loser. I think that's too harsh. I feel like that's mean. But the biggest stock down guy, and that was Stetson Bennett.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this, like a guy that has done everything he possibly can do in college, and then just decides that he's kind of done, right? Like he's like, I'm good.
And that's such a curious decision from a 25-year-old guy who's like 5'10", 5'11". And does he want to play NFL football?
Yeah, right. That's going to be a fair question.
That's what people are saying. I mean, because not only does he turn down the Senior Bowl, I know the Shrine Bowl wanted him as well. And then he turns them down. He turns both games down, and then he gets a public intoxication citation last weekend, and that's a terrible look.
Yeah, not the best way to do things. Let me ask you this: you and I we don't claim to be the offensive line guys, but our buddy Sully that does, he was tweeting a lot about those offensive line one-on-ones. And here's the thing you have to understand: Sully doesn't care at all if they win or lose. He literally does not care in that situation. What he does care about, though, is how they look when they're doing something. And the guy that he said he was out on, and that makes me curious if you read or saw anything else, was Cody Mock, the North Dakota State guy.
So Cody Mock, he's kind of like, to me, he's a little bit like the Will Levis of the offensive line class, because what do we talk about when we talk about Will Levis. Like he's a cult of personality guy. He's the guy who went viral eating a banana with the peel on it. He's the guy who went viral putting mayonnaise in his coffee. And now we have to justify why a guy who threw over 20 interceptions, like almost 25 interceptions the last 2 years, has the tools to be a top 5 NFL draft pick when you have other quarterbacks who objectively perform better, maybe not being ranked as high. So Cody Mock is a guy, he's got this, he came in, I think as a tight end. He put on a lot of weight to play offensive line. Now he's got this long hair and this big toothless grin, and he's got his belly hanging out at the practices. And those are all the kind of things that, weirdly enough, draw a lot of draft nicks to that player because again, it's this cult of personality thing. I'm kind of with Sully. Like I didn't see anything impressive out of this guy's game to make me think that his stock should skyrocket. And you look at Quinn Miners was the player who came out of Wisconsin Whitewater a couple of years ago, who was kind of that cult of personality guy, but then backed it up all throughout the week on the film, right? And I don't think Cody Mock lived up to that. You've got the belly and the long hair and the missing teeth, but you don't have the performance to match it. So it's just kind of, yeah, it's so weird to talk about, but we do talk about this every year. Like there are guys who just draw draft nicks to them because of their quirks, and this is a guy who I think falls into that category.
Anyone of note that the listener should know about whose stock might have fallen a little bit?
I was not super impressed this week with Andre Carter. I don't know how Justin
That's a
feels.
good one. No, that's a good one because
he'd been getting like first round buzz and then like back into first round and then top of second round buzz. This is a guy that had 14 and a half sacks last year and looked fantastic at times. And then this year he followed it up with 3.5 sacks. And I get Army plays in a conference and plays a lot of teams that aren't going to allow you to get sacks a ton, but he's just a guy that didn't look, we talked about like Rashee Rice and these other like group of 5 kids. Like he wasn't a guy that when you looked at him, you're like, oh yeah, he belongs on the field with everybody. Like there wasn't enough consistency for me.
Right. The fall off in terms of the sack production it has to be concerning, right? And Army, they're independents, I think, so they play kind of a weird schedule, and they're going to play those the other service academies, and it seemed like everybody had an answer for him. So that's just it's just one of those things. Like we know he has the early out if he wants to go pro. Like it used to be a challenge for these Army, Navy, Air Force guys to go pro. And now there are exceptions. The service academies, I think, are doing right by these guys by allowing them to feel their way out in these situations. But he's is it weird to say he's too tall? He's too tall. He's too slender.
That's what I was gonna say.
He has athleticism that you want out of a guy who's got that build, and it's just a body type you don't see succeed a ton at the end, right?
Right. And there's a clip on Twitter where he's in one-on-ones with DeJuan Jones, and it legit is like watching. And this is gonna sound awful when I say this. It's legit like watching like me block a kid I'm coaching. Like DeJuan Jones just takes him for a ride about 6 yards out of the play. It was crazy to watch, and you're just like, you're just kind of like, okay, like how is this guy a first rounder? And DeJuan Jones is getting talked about in the bottom of the third round.
So let me throw this out here about DeJuan Jones, because it's not really answering Jess's question, but I think it's a point that I would like to raise about these All-Star games. Steve Hutchinson, I think DeJuan Jones only practiced day one and then kind of
He got a concussion.
Okay, so he did have a legitimate reason, but Steve Hutchinson, who of course he's a Hall of Fame guy, right? He's a former Hall of Fame NFL lineman from Michigan. So he said, watching all this college football all-star game film, if you're an O lineman that thinks you've had a few good days of practice and end up skipping out on the game to keep your stock high, not sure I want that kind of guy on my team, hanging others out to dry, wrong position to be selfish. It's not clear to me who he's talking about, but you can deduce from the players who practiced early in the week that didn't play in the game who he might be talking about. But this was what I found odd about this tweet. Jim Nagy retweeted this. He quote tweeted it and he said, facts, straight from a guy with a gold jacket. That's, first of all, Jim Nagy needs to look up the definition of fact. That's clearly an opinion. And second of all, I'm not sure that's the kind of tweet you want to make if you're trying to get guys to come to your game, right?
And I think that would have been what that would is evidence of frustration of, you know, like
Right.
he recruits these guys that come to the game and he wants to showcase them.
And I think that's fine, but that is also the kind of thing that got Phil Savage in trouble when he was the director of the Shrine Game, because the Senior Bowl, because and that was back when I was actually able to go in person before I had kids. And Phil Savage would get out there on day one, right before the weigh-ins, and he would talk about all the guys who didn't make it. And
that couldn't show up.
That they didn't come. And it was like, dude, do you want guys to come to your game or do you not? Maybe poo-pooing them in front of everybody isn't the way to convince guys to come to your game. So I just found that interesting. I think Nagy, you know, I have my differences of opinion with Jim Nagy, but I think overall he does a good job. It was just curious to see him say that when, especially Seth, if Hutchinson, who I immediately jumped to the conclusion, maybe I'm wrong, but I immediately jumped to the conclusion that he was talking about DeJuan Jones because he's a Michigan guy, because he's taking a jab at an Ohio State guy. And then for Nagy to just kind of blindly retweet that, I just thought that was interesting. If you don't want guys to show up, that's a good way to do it.
But yeah,
so I guess Jim Nagy's a loser. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
sorry,
and that's,
I mean, I'll ask you for credentials and you'll shoot me down and I'll know
why. and Justin and I talked about this, and you and I talked about it a little bit the other night. Like, you hate being like, oh, these guys are fallers or losers. So we try to keep it pretty low key on this one.
We do. On the original Draft Breakdown podcast, I think we have softened over the years. If you go back and listen to the real Draft Breakdown podcast, we're probably a little bit spicier back then. But we, in our advanced years, I think we try and keep it positive, and because we want all these guys to succeed. And you know, when I talk about, for example, the Bennett thing, like, look, I'm not trying to dump on a guy who's 25 years old, who's out there partying. He's two-time national champ. He's one of the best college football play. He's going to go down in college football lore, right? But it's tough when you turn down the All-Star games and you're, you know, older and smaller, and then you get arrested. That sucks.
No, not the best look. Not the best look at all.
It's not.
And we'll end this edition of the show right there. But we've had a great discussion with Seth Cox and Justin Higdon, and you can hear more of that great discussion on the original Draft Breakdown podcast each week. And if, by all means, add yourself to the $2, at least the $2 patron level, where you can get 2 shows a week of that and hear this great analysis for that. And in this show, this is episode 397. We wrap this up. I will record at least a solo pod a little bit later in the week. I've got some what ifs and an anecdote about Patrick Mahomes as we lead up to the Super Bowl this weekend, some Cardinals connections to the Super Bowl, as well as some predictions. Maybe I can get Seth on for a few minutes to give us his predictions for the game before then. But that's Justin Higdon. Big thanks to him coming on tonight. Seth Cox, and I'm Jess Root. This is the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again later this week.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise Up Red Sea, Be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise Up Sea Red.
Roll!